The little black girl knocked at the border dispatch room, crying her mother's bag was taken by armed men. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. The sun had barely begun to rise over the desert when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the border dispatch room. A small figure appeared at the door, out of breath, her wide eyes filled with terror. She was a little black girl, no older than 8 or 9, her clothes torn and stained with dust, and her face streaked with tears. The room fell silent as she entered, a heavy tension hanging in the air. With a voice shaky from fear, she cried out, "They took my mother's bag. The men took her bag. They had guns. Please, help me." The officers in the dispatch room exchanged looks, unsure of what to make of the desperate child standing before them. The girl clutched her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, looking for someone to help her. "Please, I need to find my mom," she whimpered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the heavy equipment and murmurs of confusion. The officers could tell she was in shock. One of them, a veteran border agent named Mark, stepped forward, his face softening with concern. "It's okay, kid. We're going to help you. Just tell us what happened." The girl's lips trembled as she recounted the events in a broken voice. She had been with her mother, walking down a dirt road near the border, when a group of armed men in a black SUV had pulled up beside them. They were rough, their faces hidden under dark sunglasses and bandanas. Her mother had tried to protect her, but the men had grabbed her, taken her bag, and told her they would hurt them both if she didn't hand it over. The little girl had barely managed to escape, running as fast as she could until she found the dispatch room. Mark's expression darkened as he listened. He knew all too well what kind of danger they were facing. These men weren't ordinary criminals. They were part of a larger syndicate, one with ties that went deep into the shadows of the borderlands. Mark quickly radioed for backup, his voice steady but urgent. "We've got a situation. Armed men, possible kidnapping. I need a team out here now." As he spoke, the door to the dispatch room slammed open again. 2 more officers rushed in, their faces grim. "We got a hit on the SUV. It's registered to a known cartel," one of them said. The room filled with a sense of dread, but Mark didn't hesitate. "Get the team together," he ordered. "We're not letting those men get away with this." The little girl, still trembling, was escorted to a safe room by one of the officers, but Mark couldn't shake the image of her fear-stricken face from his mind. The cartel had a reputation for ruthless violence, and this wasn't just a robbery. It was a warning. As Mark prepared to lead the charge, he knew one thing for certain. This was going to be a battle they weren't prepared for, but it was one they couldn't afford to lose. As the radio crackled to life, Mark's heart raced. "Backup is on the way," one of the officers assured him, but he could feel the urgency in the air. He glanced toward the little girl, now sitting quietly in the safe room, her face pale and tired from the shock. She had been through so much in such a short time, and Mark couldn't shake the image of her wide, frightened eyes. It was clear to him that the situation had just escalated from a simple robbery to something far more sinister. He knew the kind of men they were dealing with, cartel members with a history of violence that went beyond theft. They had no regard for life, and this little girl and her mother were now caught in the middle of it all. Mark turned to his team. "We can't waste any time. Get the surveillance on the perimeter. I want eyes on every corner of this place. We need to know where they're headed." The officers nodded and quickly dispersed, some heading to the control room while others set up along the perimeter, keeping a watchful eye on the border crossing and the surrounding area. Mark couldn't afford to wait. The minutes seemed to drag on, the tension rising with each passing second. He had made a promise to this little girl's mother 5 years ago, a promise to keep her safe, and now, here he was, staring down the barrel of a life-threatening situation. He had always respected the thin line that separated order from chaos, but this felt like a breaking point. Mark paced the room, his mind running through possible scenarios. The cartel was ruthless, and if they were trying to send a message, they would likely double down. His gut told him that they weren't just here to steal the bag. They had a deeper agenda, and it was one that involved much more than money. The longer this dragged on, the more dangerous it would become. He needed to get ahead of them, fast. Just as Mark's thoughts began to race, a sharp voice interrupted his focus. "Sir, we have a location." The SUV was spotted heading toward the industrial area about 10 miles east of here. "We believe it's an abandoned warehouse. Should we engage?" Mark didn't hesitate. "Yes, but keep it low-key. No unnecessary confrontation. We're looking for the mother and the bag, not a firefight. I want this clean." He grabbed his gear and turned toward the door. As he stepped out, he saw his team assembling, ready to move. The tension in the air was palpable, but they all knew what needed to be done. They had no choice but to push forward. Mark led the way, his heart pounding as they made their way to the vehicles. The convoy of cars, filled with agents and backup units, sped toward the location with lights flashing, cutting through the night like a trail of fire. The cold wind whipped past Mark's face as he sat in the front seat, staring out the window, his mind focused on one thing: getting the little girl's mother back. The ride felt like it took forever, the engine's hum a constant reminder of the gravity of the situation. With each mile that passed, Mark's mind replayed the words the little girl had said. "They took my mother's bag." It wasn't just a bag, Mark knew. It was a symbol of everything these criminals were willing to destroy. His team pulled up to the industrial area, the lights of the warehouse casting long shadows on the ground. The area was deserted, save for a few rusted cars scattered along the lot. Mark's instincts screamed that something wasn't right. He signaled for his team to stay low, and they crept forward, making their way to the entrance. As they approached the warehouse, Mark felt a chill run down his spine. The place was eerily quiet, but his gut told him that this was the calm before the storm. "Check the back," Mark whispered to one of the officers. "We'll take the front." They positioned themselves in their respective places, weapons ready. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He could feel the adrenaline surge through his veins as he signaled for the breach. The doors flew open, and the team rushed in, their movements swift and coordinated. The air inside the warehouse was thick with the smell of rust and old machinery, but Mark barely registered it. His eyes scanned the room, looking for any sign of the missing mother. It wasn't until he heard a faint sound, a soft moan, that he turned toward the back corner. There, tied to a chair, was the woman. She was barely conscious, her face bruised and swollen, but she was alive. Relief washed over Mark like a wave. They had found her, but the job wasn't over yet. He quickly approached, cutting the ropes that bound her. "We're getting you out of here," Mark said gently, his voice soft but firm. But as he helped the woman to her feet, a loud crash echoed from the back of the warehouse. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound. The situation had just taken another dangerous turn. As Mark helped the woman to her feet, a loud crash rang out from the far end of the warehouse. His heart skipped a beat. The chaos wasn't over yet. In an instant, Mark's hand instinctively reached for his weapon, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The rest of the team froze, alert, their weapons drawn. "Stay low. Stay quiet," Mark whispered, signaling for everyone to remain still. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Mark's mind raced. He had to think fast. The mission had gone from a search and rescue to a full-blown firefight in seconds. He looked at the woman, who was barely standing, her eyes wide with terror. "We're not safe yet," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You need to stay down." She nodded weakly, her body trembling. "We're going to get you out of here," Mark added, more to reassure himself than her. His team was in position now, each officer taking up their spots along the warehouse's perimeter. Mark signaled for one of them to check the side door. "Eyes on the exit," he muttered under his breath, not taking his eyes off the shadows. It felt like an eternity before the next sound broke the stillness. A low hum, then a rumble. Mark's mind caught up with the sound before his body did. The SUV, he thought. They've come back. The vehicle was unmistakable, its engine roaring as it sped toward the warehouse. Mark's pulse quickened. The stakes had just been raised. He couldn't let them take the woman again. He couldn't let them get away. "Get to cover," Mark shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. The team scattered, finding strategic positions behind old crates and rusted machinery. Mark felt the adrenaline flood his body. The window for action was closing fast. He needed to make the next move. He checked the woman again. She was struggling to stay conscious, her face pale and drenched in sweat. We need to get her out of here, now, Mark thought, but he couldn't do that without first dealing with the threat. The crash from earlier had drawn attention, but now the sound of the approaching SUV confirmed it was more than just a diversion. The men from the cartel were back. Mark's team had managed to secure the woman, but now it was time to face the reality of what they were up against. The odds were stacking up against them. His hand trembled slightly as he held his weapon, but he steadied himself. He had faced worse in his career, and this was no different. Stay sharp, Mark said into his radio, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding. We engage when they come in. No one moves until I give the order. The noise grew louder, and the growl of the engine was now unmistakable. The SUV had arrived. Mark's breath caught in his throat. There were no more distractions, no more time to waste. The time for waiting was over. His team was ready. The door to the warehouse slammed open, and through the haze of dust and dim lighting, the cartel members entered. They were menacing, their expressions cold, their hands resting on the guns at their sides. Mark's eyes narrowed. This wasn't going to be easy. We're going to need backup, Mark thought, but it was too late for that. The cartel had already made their move. Mark's hand signaled to his team, and without hesitation, the officers opened fire. The warehouse erupted into chaos. The sound of gunfire echoed off the walls, deafening in the confined space. Mark ducked behind a nearby crate, his heart pounding as he assessed the situation. The cartel men were taking cover, but they were well trained. They were returning fire, and it was clear this was going to be a brutal fight. The woman was still unconscious, lying in a corner. Mark's team kept her covered as best they could, but they couldn't let their guard down for a second. Every movement, every sound, every breath counted. Move up, Mark shouted, his voice cutting through the din. His team responded, moving quickly to take control of the situation. The cartel members were trapped now, their escape routes blocked by Mark's team, but they weren't giving up easily. Mark knew this wasn't just a matter of arresting criminals. These men weren't afraid to die, and that made them all the more dangerous. As the gunfight continued, Mark's mind raced. How long could they hold out? The woman needed medical attention, and the little girl was still out there somewhere, waiting for her mother. Mark couldn't afford to fail. He couldn't let the cartel win. The sound of the SUV's engine still roared outside, its engines revving, waiting for the moment to strike. The battle wasn't over yet, but Mark would fight until the last breath, for the woman, for the girl, and for the promise he had made. The gunfire was deafening, echoing off the concrete walls of the warehouse as Mark's team engaged the cartel members. Bullets whizzed past, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Mark crouched behind the heavy machinery, his heart pounding, but his mind focused. The woman was still unconscious in the corner, but his team had her covered for. Now, his eyes flicked to the entrance as the cartel members took cover, some behind crates, others crouching by the walls. Mark knew they had to end this quickly. Move up, he shouted, and his team reacted immediately. They sprinted across the floor, dodging behind pillars and machinery, making their way toward the cartel members. Mark led the charge, his weapon aimed steady. The roar of the engines outside grew louder. The SUV was still there, waiting for the cartel to retreat. It was their lifeline, their escape route, and Mark knew they couldn't let them leave. We need to end this now, Mark thought, his pulse racing. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. His team had already been through a lot, and the firefight was taking a toll. Stay focused. Keep your heads down, he reminded them. They had to hold the line, to make sure the cartel didn't escape. As Mark reached a safe spot, he heard a shout from across the room. One of his officers had been hit. The man was crouching behind a stack of crates, his hand clutching his side, blood seeping between his fingers. Mark's heart sank. We need to get him out, Mark thought, but he couldn't risk exposing his team. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had the advantage of position. Keep your fire on them, Mark ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. He had to move fast. He gestured for two of his team members to cover him, and he darted across the room to help the injured officer. The pain in his side was sharp, but the officer gritted his teeth and held on. Mark helped him to his feet, and they made their way back to cover. As they retreated, a loud crash rang out, followed by the sound of the SUV's engine roaring to life. The The cartel was trying to escape. Mark's heart raced. No way they're getting away, he muttered. He signaled for the team to advance. Move. Take them down. The final assault was swift and brutal. Mark's team stormed the remaining cartel members, catching them off guard. The fight was fierce, but the cartel's resistance crumbled under the weight of Mark's team's precision and firepower. The last of the cartel members were quickly subdued, their weapons clattering to the ground. The warehouse was silent, save for the heavy breathing of Mark and his team. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The woman was still unconscious, and the little girl's safety was still uncertain. Mark approached the woman, checking for signs of life. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. He gave a quick nod to the team medic. We need to stabilize her. Get her out of here, he said. The medic nodded, quickly setting to work. Meanwhile, Mark's thoughts raced. The little girl had been through so much already, and now her mother was in critical condition. The cartel's threat wasn't over. They had to leave the warehouse immediately, but there was still the issue of the cartel's leader and the SUV. Mark's mind raced as he calculated their next move. Just then, one of his team members ran over, eyes wide. Sir, we've got a problem. The cartel's leader has made a call. We've got backup on the way. This fight isn't over. Mark's jaw tightened. How much time do we have? He asked, his voice steady. Maybe 15 minutes before reinforcements arrive, the officer replied. Mark looked at the woman, still unconscious, and then to his team. We need to move, and we need to move now, he said. Get the woman to the extraction point. I'll hold off the reinforcements. His team looked at him, and without a word, they began to move. They knew what had to be done. Mark stayed behind, keeping an eye on the entrance, his gun ready. The time was running out, but he couldn't let the cartel get away again. This was their only chance. His heart raced as the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Mark took a deep breath, his finger on the trigger. Reinforcements were coming, but Mark was ready. He wouldn't let the cartel win. Not while he still had a breath in his body. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the warehouse as Mark stood his ground, his eyes locked on the entrance. His team was already making their way to the extraction point, the woman in critical condition, but Mark knew they couldn't afford to leave without dealing with the cartel reinforcements. The last thing he needed was another shootout, but he had no choice. He checked his weapon again, his grip tight and steady, and positioned himself behind a pillar, out of sight but ready to act. The minutes felt like hours as he waited. The tension was unbearable. Each second that ticked by brought them closer to the cartel reinforcements. Mark knew this was their last chance to stop them. The sound of tires screeching broke the silence. The reinforcements had arrived. The noise from the SUVs outside grew louder, and Mark's heart began to race. He couldn't afford to let them get any closer. He peered around the corner, watching as two black SUVs pulled into the lot, the headlights slicing through the dust. His team was still making their way to the exit, but Mark couldn't leave them behind. He had to make sure they were safe, and that meant taking down the cartel reinforcements first. Mark's eyes narrowed as he counted the number of men who emerged from the vehicles. It was at least 8, armed and dangerous. They were walking toward the entrance, their steps heavy and deliberate. Mark had no intention of letting them get any closer. He pulled out his radio and spoke softly but firmly. Team, we've got company. Reinforcements are here. Get to the exit now, I'll hold them off. He didn't wait for a response. The plan was clear. Mark had one shot at this. He peeked out from behind the pillar and took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The cartel members were almost at the door. He raised his weapon, aiming carefully at the first man in line. His finger hovered over the trigger. He needed to make the first shot count. Just as he was about to fire, the lead cartel member turned, his eyes locking onto Mark's position. It was too late to hide now. The gunfire started almost instantly. Mark fired, hitting the cartel member square in the chest, but the others were already returning fire. The warehouse erupted into chaos again, the noise deafening as bullets ricocheted off the steel walls. Mark dove behind another stack of crates, narrowly avoiding the barrage. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, every nerve on edge. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he focused. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting the woman and the girl. He peeked around the crates, firing back at the cartel members, one shot after another. His team was doing their best to cover him, but it was clear they were outnumbered. The reinforcements weren't giving up without a fight. Mark could feel the pressure mounting. He had to buy them enough time to escape. "Cover me," Mark shouted, and one of his team members sprinted across the open floor to join him. They fired in unison, creating a wall of fire that forced the cartel members to retreat. But Mark knew it wouldn't be enough. The reinforcements were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Mark glanced over at the extraction point. His team had made it to the vehicles, the woman already secured in the back of the truck. But the little girl, she was still inside the warehouse, her safety hanging in the balance. Mark's stomach churned as he thought about her, alone and scared. He couldn't let them take her. With one last glance at his team, Mark made a split-second decision. He sprinted toward the back of the warehouse, dodging gunfire as he went. He knew he was putting himself in danger, but the little girl needed him. He had to get her out. Mark reached the back room where the girl had been hiding earlier. She was still there, crouched in the corner, trembling with fear. She looked up when she saw him, her wide eyes full of desperation. "Are you here to take me home?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the gunfire. Mark nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "Yes, we're going to get you out of here," he said, his voice firm but kind. He reached down to help her up, but before they could make it out of the room, a loud crash echoed from behind them. One of the cartel members had found them. Mark turned just in time to see the man raise his weapon, aiming directly at them. There was no time to think. Mark acted on instinct, pulling the little girl behind him as he fired. The cartel member dropped to the ground, his weapon clattering beside him. But there were more coming. Mark knew they couldn't stay here much longer. He grabbed the girl's hand, and together they ran toward the exit. The sound of gunfire rang out again, but Mark was focused. His team was waiting for them, and they needed to move fast. As they reached the vehicles, Mark looked back one last time, making sure everyone was out. The battle wasn't over, but they had made it. Mark climbed into the truck, the little girl beside him, her face still filled with fear, but now with a glimmer of hope. "We're safe now," he whispered, more to reassure himself than her. But deep down, he knew the fight was far from over. The truck's engine roared to life, and Mark slammed his foot on the accelerator, pushing the vehicle forward. The wheels spun, kicking up dirt as they sped away from the warehouse, the sound of gunfire still echoing in the distance. Mark glanced over at the little girl, her wide eyes locked on him, her face a mixture of fear and relief. "You're safe now," Mark reassured her, but he knew the situation wasn't over. The cartel wouldn't stop, not until they had what they wanted. The convoy of vehicles followed closely behind, Mark's team staying in formation as they moved through the winding dirt roads. The woman, still unconscious, was secured in the back of one of the other trucks, the medics working tirelessly to stabilize her. Mark knew they were running out of time. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him, the responsibility to keep them safe, to get them out of harm's way. His mind raced. He had done everything he could, but the cartel's leader was still out there. They weren't done yet. Mark kept his eyes on the road ahead, the headlights of the convoy illuminating the path as they cut through the darkness. The little girl remained quiet, her small hands clenched tightly around the seatbelt, her body still trembling. Mark glanced at her again. He needed to reassure her, but the words didn't seem to come. Instead, he focused on the task at hand. They needed to get to the safe house, but there were still too many unknowns. The sound of the radio crackling in his ear broke through his thoughts. "Mark, this is Tom. We've got movement. Looks like a couple of vehicles are following us. They're closing in fast." Mark's stomach dropped. It was the reinforcements. They hadn't given up. "Stay sharp," Mark ordered into the radio. "We can't let them catch us." He pushed the truck harder, his foot pressing down on the gas as they navigated the winding road. He could feel the pressure building. The cartel was coming, and they wouldn't stop until they had the woman and the girl. Mark turned to the little girl. "Listen to me, okay? We're going to a safe place. Just stay calm, and we'll be there soon." She nodded, her wide eyes filled with trust, but Mark could see the fear still in them. He couldn't blame her. She had been through too much. His mind went back to the moment when they had found her, hiding in the corner of the warehouse. She had been alone, scared, and desperate. Mark had promised to protect her, to make sure she got home safe, but now it was more complicated than that. "How much farther?" Mark asked over the radio. "Not far, just keep going straight," came the reply from Tom. Mark nodded, his grip tightening on the wheel as they pushed forward. The sound of the approaching vehicles grew louder, and Mark could feel the tension building. They weren't going to outrun them for long. Prepare for a fight, Mark muttered to himself. They had to be ready. The road ahead was starting to get rougher, the ground uneven and bumpy. The truck jolted as it hit a particularly deep rut, but Mark didn't slow down. The little girl let out a soft whimper, but Mark quickly glanced at her, giving her a reassuring nod. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. They had to get to the safe house. The convoy was close behind, and Mark's mind raced with possible plans. The cartel's reinforcements were relentless, but so was he. They would get through this. As they approached a sharp turn, Mark saw the headlights of the vehicles behind them reflecting off the trees. They were closing in. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Hold on tight, Mark told the little girl. The truck veered sharply to the left as Mark expertly maneuvered through the bend, trying to put some distance between them and the cartel. The roar of the engines behind them intensified as the vehicles followed suit. Mark's grip tightened on the wheel. He had to lose them. The path ahead was narrow and winding, the trees on either side casting long shadows. It was risky, but Mark was willing to take it. He pushed the truck even harder, the tires screeching as they slid. Around another bend. The road was treacherous, but Mark kept his focus, eyes on the path ahead. He could hear the sound of the pursuing vehicles getting closer, their engines roaring behind them. But then, just as quickly as the sound had gotten louder, it began to fade. Mark looked in the rearview mirror and saw the headlights of the cartel vehicles flickering in the distance, their pursuit slowing down. We're losing them, Mark muttered under his breath. The little girl let out a sigh of relief. But Mark wasn't ready to celebrate yet. He knew they weren't safe until they reached the safe house. As they neared the edge of the woods, Mark spotted the flashing lights of the safe house in the distance. The convoy had made it. They were almost there. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. We're almost there, he whispered, more to himself than to the little girl. He could see the lights of the safe house now, just up ahead. They were close. But as they drove closer, Mark saw a shadow move in front of the entrance. Someone was waiting for them. He slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just inches from the figure in front of them. The headlights illuminated the man standing in their way. Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was the cartel leader. Mark's truck came to a screeching halt just inches from the cartel leader, standing in the entrance of the safe house. The headlights of the vehicle cut through the dark, illuminating the man in the middle of the road. His cold, calculating eyes met Mark's through the windshield, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The air was thick with tension as the two men stared each other down. Mark's hand instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The little girl beside him was still quiet, her eyes wide in fear as she peered over at the figure in the road. Mark knew they were at a crossroads. The cartel leader stood between them and safety, and there was no way around him. Get out of the truck, the cartel leader called out, his voice smooth but filled with menace. Mark didn't move, his gaze never leaving the man. He wasn't about to give up so easily. He'd already fought too hard to let it end here. Slowly, he reached for his radio, his voice low but steady. Team, prepare for contact. We have a problem. He didn't need to say more. His team understood. As Mark prepared to step out of the truck, the cartel leader slowly began to walk toward him, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. Mark's heart raced, but he kept his cool. He had to make sure the little girl was safe. He turned to her, giving her a firm but reassuring nod. Stay down. I'll handle this, he said quietly. She nodded, her face pale but trusting. Mark opened the door and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. He could feel the cool night air hit his face, but it didn't shake his resolve. You're not going anywhere, the cartel leader sneered, his eyes scanning the convoy behind Mark. You've made a big mistake, officer. Mark didn't flinch. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to end this, he said, his voice hard with determination. The cartel leader's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of someone who thought they held the upper hand. You think you can stop me? The leader taunted, his hand moving closer to his weapon. Mark's eyes flicked to the other members of his team, who were quietly taking positions behind him. They were ready. Mark nodded, signaling them to hold steady. We've already won, Mark said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. The cartel leader paused, clearly thrown off guard by Mark's boldness. For a brief second, Mark saw the uncertainty in the leader's eyes, but it vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. With a swift motion, the leader drew his weapon, pointing it directly at Mark's chest. Mark didn't hesitate. He dove to the side, hitting the ground hard as the first shot rang out. The sound of gunfire shattered the silence of the night, and Mark rolled behind a stack of crates for cover. His team returned fire immediately, creating a wall of bullets that forced the cartel leader to take cover as well. Mark's mind raced as he repositioned, trying to get a clear shot. His training kicked in, and he focused on the task at hand, keeping the little girl and his team safe. He could hear the other vehicles in the convoy behind him, but his focus was on the cartel leader. He couldn't let him get away. Mark peeked out from behind the crates, spotting the cartel leader moving quickly to the left, trying to flank his position. Without thinking, Mark stood and fired, hitting the man in the shoulder. The leader grunted in pain but didn't go down. He was tougher than Mark had expected. The fight was far from over. Mark's team continued to lay down cover fire, but the cartel leader wasn't backing down. He was relentless, pushing forward despite the wound. Mark knew they had to finish this fast before reinforcements arrived. He took a deep breath, then rushed forward, using the crates for cover as he moved. He couldn't let the leader get to the little girl. As he neared the leader's position, Mark heard a rustling sound behind him. He turned just in time to see one of the cartel's backup men attempting to sneak up on him. Without hesitation, Mark shot, the man dropping to the ground with a thud. He didn't have time to dwell on it. Mark reached the cartel leader, who was now struggling to get to his feet. With a final, swift motion, Mark tackled him to the ground, pinning him beneath his weight. "It's over," Mark said, his voice steady. The cartel leader struggled, but Mark held him down, knowing the danger wasn't fully gone yet. "Not yet." The leader spat, his breath labored. "You think this is over? You have no idea what you've started." Mark's grip tightened, but before he could say anything else, the sound of sirens in the distance made his heart race. Reinforcements were coming. Mark knew they had to leave now. He motioned to his team, signaling for them to move out. The fight wasn't over yet, but they had won victory. The little girl was safe, the woman was being taken care of, and they had stopped the cartel for now. As they piled into the trucks and sped off into the night, Mark knew that this was just the beginning. The battle against the cartel was far from over, but for tonight, they had won. Mark's eyes locked onto the rearview mirror, watching as the safe house disappeared in the distance. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would be ready for whatever came next. As Mark and his team sped through the dark, winding roads, the sound of the sirens in the distance seemed to fade into nothingness. The weight of what had just happened hung heavily in the air, but Mark knew they couldn't stop. Not yet. He glanced over at the little girl in the passenger seat. Her wide eyes were still filled with fear, but there was something else in them now, a faint glimmer of hope. Mark had promised her safety, and he had kept that promise, for now. But he knew it wasn't over. The cartel was still out there, and the leader's words echoed in his mind. "You have no idea what you've started." The words sent a chill down his spine. Mark pushed the gas pedal harder, the truck roaring to life as they made their way toward a new location. The convoy followed closely behind, keeping the formation tight. They needed to get to a new safe house, one that the cartel didn't know about. Mark glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as the headlights of their convoy illuminated the road behind them. The road ahead was long, and they had no idea what kind of danger awaited them. But one thing was certain, the cartel wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Mark's thoughts were interrupted by a voice crackling over the radio. "Mark, this is Tom. We've got a problem. There's a roadblock up ahead. Looks like the cartel is waiting for us." Mark's heart sank. It was a trap. The cartel had anticipated their move. They were ready. "How far is the roadblock?" Mark asked, his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. "About 5 miles out," Tom replied. Mark's mind raced. 5 miles was too close. He had to make a decision. Fast. "We need to change direction. Take the side roads. Get us around that block," Mark ordered. He looked at the little girl again, who was now clutching the seatbelt with white knuckles. "We're going to be fine," Mark reassured her, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. They veered off onto a narrow, less traveled road, hoping it would take them off the cartel's radar. The truck bounced along the dirt path, the tires screeching as they navigated the rough terrain. Mark's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror once more. The Convoy was still with him, but the distance between them and the cartel was closing fast. They're going to catch up, Mark muttered under his breath. We need to lose them. The road ahead was dark and treacherous, but Mark had been in worse situations before. He knew what needed to be done. Stay sharp, he called over the radio. We're almost there. Keep the convoy close. But the road seemed to stretch on forever. The headlights of the cartel's vehicles were visible now, getting closer with every passing second. Mark's pulse quickened as he pushed the truck to its limits. But he knew they couldn't outrun them forever. Prepare for a fight, he said to his team. We'll hold them off as long as we can. As the convoy raced through the night, Mark's thoughts went back to the moment he had promised the little girl's mother that he would protect her. He had made that promise 5 years ago, and he wouldn't break it now. He glanced at her again, her small frame barely visible in the dim light. She was still so young, too young to be caught up in something like this. Mark's grip tightened on the wheel. He had to get them to safety, no matter the cost. The convoy was nearing an intersection, and Mark knew this was their last chance to make a clean break. Take the left, Mark shouted over the radio. He didn't know if it would work, but it was their best shot. The trucks skidded around the corner, their tires screeching on the gravel road as they turned sharply. But it was too late. The cartel had anticipated their move. The trucks behind them came to a sudden halt, the sound of heavy engines filling the air. The roadblock had been set up ahead. The cartel had outmaneuvered them. Mark's heart pounded as he scanned the scene. The cartel's vehicles were blocking the road ahead, and their men were already jumping out, weapons drawn. It was a standoff. Mark's team quickly dismounted from the trucks, weapons at the ready. They had no choice now but to fight. Stay low. Stay close, Mark commanded. The last thing he wanted was for the little girl to witness this, but there was no way to shield her now. The tension in the air was thick as Mark's team prepared for the inevitable. The cartel's men spread out, surrounding them on all sides. The situation had escalated, and there was no way out but through. Mark knew it was time to make his stand. He turned to his team. We fight to protect. We fight to win. The first shots rang out, cutting through the silence. The fight was on. Mark's team fired back, the sound of gunshots echoing through the night as they engaged the cartel. Mark could hear the little girl crying in the truck behind him, but he couldn't stop now. His focus was on the men in front of him. This was the moment he had been preparing for. He wasn't about to let the cartel win. Not today. The gunfire echoed through the night as Mark and his team crouched behind their vehicles, returning fire with precision. The cartel members had them cornered, but Mark wasn't about to back down. The woman in the back of the truck was stable for now, but the little girl was still in the passenger seat, her face pressed against the window, eyes wide with fear. Mark couldn't afford to think about anything but getting them both to safety. His team was holding their own, but the cartel wasn't letting up. They were heavily armed, and Mark could tell they were organized. We need to move. Now, Mark ordered, his voice low but urgent. His team responded immediately, shifting into position to provide cover fire as Mark moved toward the side of the road. The standoff had dragged on too long, and the cartel's reinforcements were only a few minutes away. They had to get out of there. Mark glanced back at the convoy. His eyes locked with the little girl's through the truck's rear window, her face pale with fear. He couldn't let her see any more of this. He had promised her mother that he would keep her safe, and he wasn't about to break that promise now. The sounds of the gunfight continued to ring out, but Mark's focus was entirely on getting the girl to safety. Move up, he shouted to his team, and they began advancing under cover, pushing forward with coordinated precision. Mark led the charge, his weapon at the ready as he sprinted to the next piece of cover. The wind whipped through the trees, and the ground beneath his boots was soft and uneven. But he barely noticed. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his training kept him calm. They had trained for this moment. They had to win. He could hear the sound of more cartel members closing in. They were trying to flank the team, but Mark wasn't about to let them succeed. Watch your six, he warned his team. As they moved forward, the sound of more gunshots rang out from the woods, and Mark knew that reinforcements had arrived. They were surrounded. The tension in the air was thick, and the fight had reached a boiling point. Mark's mind raced, but his body moved on instinct. He ducked behind a fallen tree, firing back at the approaching cartel members, taking careful aim with each shot. His heart was steady, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. The little girl was depending on him. His team continued to push forward, keeping the cartel members at bay, but Mark could feel the pressure building. "We need to make a break for it," Mark said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. His team nodded, knowing exactly what needed to be done. Mark looked back at the little girl, still huddled in the truck. She was safe for now, but they couldn't stay here. "We're leaving," Mark said firmly. "Move out." He sprinted toward the convoy, and his team followed, providing cover as they made their way back to the trucks. Mark's eyes never left the little girl as he ran toward the vehicle, his heart racing with every step. He couldn't afford to lose her now. As they reached the trucks, Mark's team quickly loaded into the vehicles, and they sped off, the sound of gunfire still echoing in the distance. The convoy tore down the narrow road, dust kicking up behind them as they made their way to the safe house. The little girl was quiet now, but Mark could see the exhaustion in her eyes. He knew she was still scared, still processing everything she had seen. But at least she was safe for now. The road ahead was uncertain, but Mark couldn't stop. Not until they were out of danger. "How much further?" Mark asked over the radio, his eyes scanning the dark road ahead. "Not far," came the response. "Just keep going straight. We'll get you there." Mark nodded, his grip tight on the steering wheel. As they sped through the night, the sirens were growing quieter now, but Mark didn't relax. Not yet. The cartel was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had the woman and the girl. As they neared the safe house, Mark could see the flashing lights in the distance. He felt a brief sense of relief. They were almost there. But as they pulled up to the entrance, something didn't feel right. Mark's instincts kicked in. He signaled for the convoy to stop, his hand on his weapon. The lights ahead weren't the welcoming kind. "Get ready," Mark said quietly to his team. "We're not alone." His heart raced as he scanned the area, his mind already processing the possibilities. This wasn't just a safe house. It was a trap. The cartel had found them. And this time, there would be no running. Mark's team quickly disembarked, taking up positions behind the vehicles. They were ready for anything. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Mark's eyes narrowed as he saw shadows moving in the distance. He couldn't let the little girl see this, but there was no way around it. "Stay down," Mark told her, his voice calm but firm. He turned to his team, giving them a silent nod. They were about to face whatever came next, but they would face it together. The battle wasn't over yet, and they had no choice but to fight. Mark gripped his weapon tightly, prepared to protect the little girl at all costs. This was it, the final stand. The night was eerily still, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind and the low hum of Mark's breathing. His eyes darted over the darkened landscape, searching for movement, but the shadows were thick and unforgiving. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They had made it this far, but the danger wasn't over. His team had positioned themselves strategically, keeping low, weapons at the ready, while Mark stayed close to the little girl, who was now curled up inside the truck. Her wide eyes still held fear, but there was a faint trace of trust in them. Mark wasn't sure if it was because she believed him, or because she didn't have anyone else to rely on. Either way, he wasn't going to let her down. Mark glanced over at his team. Every one of them was ready. They had been through hell together, and they knew what needed to be done. The cartel had found them, but this time, Mark had a plan. He wasn't going to let them take another step forward. "Stay quiet, stay close," Mark ordered his team, his voice calm but urgent. The tension in the air was palpable as they waited, crouched in the shadows, the moonlight casting long, eerie beams through the trees. Mark's mind raced. They needed to hold their ground. The cartel members, though fewer in number now, were just as dangerous as ever. They had already lost too many men trying to get to Mark's convoy, and Mark knew they would do anything to finish what they had started. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Mark's heart skipped a beat. They were coming. His team adjusted their positions, their movements synchronized as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Mark looked down at the little girl, her face now a mixture of confusion and fear, and his heart ached. He had promised her safety, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. She had already seen too much, been through too much. No child should have to face what she had. But he couldn't change the past. All he could do now was make sure she had a future. "We'll get through this," Mark whispered to her, though he wasn't entirely sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. He turned his attention back to the advancing cartel members, who were now mere yards away. He could hear their voices, low and harsh, but he didn't need to understand their words. He knew what they were capable of. The moment was now. Mark gave the signal. Go. The quiet command was followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. His team moved with lightning speed, bursting from the shadows and taking up positions behind the vehicles, using them as cover. Mark was the first to engage, his weapon firing in controlled bursts as he picked off one cartel member after another. The rest of the team followed suit, their guns roaring as they fought back with everything they had. The firefight was intense. The cartel members were well armed, and they had the advantage of numbers. But Mark's team had something they didn't: strategy. Mark ducked behind a nearby tree, reloading as the sound of bullets whizzed past him. He peeked out from behind the trunk, his eyes scanning for targets. He spotted a cartel member moving toward the truck, his weapon aimed directly at the little girl. Mark's heart lurched. No, he shouted as he popped out from behind cover, firing a single shot that dropped the man to the ground. The little girl was safe, but there were still more cartel members to deal with. The firefight continued to rage around them, the sound of gunshots filling the air as both sides fought for control. Mark's team was holding strong, but the cartel wasn't backing down. Mark knew they couldn't keep this up for long. The truck was still their primary means of escape, but they needed a way out. He glanced over at his team, who were exchanging fire with the remaining cartel members. We need to move now, Mark shouted. He looked over at the little girl, who was huddled down low in the truck, her face pale but determined. Get to the truck, Mark yelled, and his team immediately began moving to cover the retreat. The cartel, realizing their position was compromised, began to fall back, but they weren't leaving without a fight. Mark's team covered each other as they made their way to the truck, moving with speed and precision. Mark took one last look at the remaining cartel members, his weapon raised, before he sprinted toward the truck, making sure to stay low. The fight wasn't over yet, but they were making progress. The truck's engine roared to life once again, and Mark climbed inside, the little girl close behind him. We're getting out of here, Mark said firmly, his voice laced with determination. As the truck sped off into the night, Mark knew they were not safe yet. The road ahead was uncertain, but they had survived this battle. They had made it through the worst, but the fight against the cartel was far from over. Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel as the convoy raced through the night. He couldn't let his guard down now. The cartel had shown they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But Mark had something they didn't. He had his team. And he had the promise he had made. That was enough. For now, the convoy sped down the winding roads, the sound of their engines echoing in the night. The truck Mark was driving bounced over the uneven terrain, but he didn't dare slow down. The little girl sat quietly beside him, her face still pale, but her eyes holding a flicker of hope that wasn't there before. She had been through too much, but Mark couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not yet. Not with the cartel still hunting them. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as his team followed closely behind. The road was dark, the trees on either side casting long shadows, and the only light came from the convoy's headlights cutting through the night. Mark's mind raced as he thought about the events of the past few hours. They had barely escaped the warehouse, only to find themselves in another fight for their lives. The cartel was relentless, and Mark knew they wouldn't stop until they had the woman, the girl, and whatever they were after. But Mark wasn't going to let that happen. Not on his watch. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he pushed the truck faster, the engine roaring in protest as they hit another rough patch of road. The safe house wasn't far now, but the further they went, the more Mark felt the weight of what was to come. Stay close, stay sharp. Mark spoke into his radio, his voice low but firm. His team responded with a series of affirmations. They had worked together for years, and Mark trusted them with his life. But tonight, the stakes were higher than ever. Mark, this is Tom. We've got a visual on the road ahead. Looks clear for now, but there's a vehicle up ahead about a mile. Might be cartel. Mark's heart skipped a beat. They couldn't risk getting caught in another ambush. Roger that. Keep an eye on it, Mark replied, trying to keep his voice steady. The truck bounced again, and the little girl winced, clutching her seatbelt. Mark reached over, giving her hand a gentle squeeze, and she looked up at him, her eyes full of uncertainty. We're almost there, he said quietly, trying to reassure her, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The convoy continued to race through the night, the engine noise filling the air as they neared the turnoff for the safe house. Mark's heart began to race as he saw the faint glow of lights in the distance. It was a welcome sight, but something in his gut told him not to relax just yet. As they rounded the bend, Mark saw the shadow of a vehicle up ahead. It was parked at an odd angle, its headlights dim. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something's not right, he muttered under his breath. His foot hovered over the brake, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to, not when they were so close. As they approached the parked vehicle, Mark's radio crackled again. "Mark, it's a trap. We've got movement up ahead. It's a roadblock." His blood ran cold. "How many?" Mark barked into the radio. "At least 5 vehicles, maybe more," Tom replied. Mark's mind raced. The roadblock was well coordinated. The cartel had planned this. They knew exactly where they were going. There was no way around it. Mark swore under his breath. "Brace for impact," he ordered, slamming his foot on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, the engine roaring as they sped toward the roadblock. The headlights of the cartel vehicles flashed brightly ahead, but Mark wasn't going to stop. He had no choice. His team was right behind him, but Mark knew they couldn't outrun this. "Get ready to fight," Mark shouted over the radio, his heart pounding in his chest. The roadblock was closing in fast, and the cartel members were already getting into position. They had the advantage. Mark swerved the truck sharply to the left, dodging the first vehicle in their path. He could hear the screech of tires as the convoy followed suit, trying to avoid being caught in the crossfire. The gunfire started almost immediately, the sound of bullets pinging off the metal of the truck. Mark's hands tightened around the steering wheel as he focused on the road ahead, narrowly avoiding another vehicle that swerved into his path. The convoy followed closely behind, but the road was getting narrower, and the cartel members were closing in fast. Mark knew they couldn't keep this up forever. The sound of gunshots continued to fill the air as his team returned fire, but the odds were against them. Mark's truck bounced again as they hit another pothole, sending a jolt through his body. The little girl was crying now, her hands gripping the seatbelt so tightly that her knuckles were white. "Stay down," Mark shouted at her, trying to keep his voice calm as they swerved to avoid another roadblock. He had to get them out of this. He couldn't let the cartel take them. Not now. As they approached a tight curve in the road, Mark saw another cartel vehicle blocking their way. He swerved to the right, narrowly avoiding it. His heart pounded in his chest as they tore through the night, gunfire still ringing in the air. Mark's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. They couldn't outrun the cartel, but he wasn't about to give up. He had to keep his team safe, and the little girl depended on him. "Hold on," Mark yelled, as the convoy made a sharp turn, the tires screeching as they barely made the corner. The road ahead was still clear, but the cartel was right behind them. Mark had one chance left. He floored the accelerator, the truck roaring as they sped forward, leaving the roadblock behind them. The convoy followed closely, but the pursuit was relentless. Mark knew the battle wasn't over. But for now, they had made it out. The road ahead was uncertain, but Mark wasn't going to stop until they were safe. The truck roared through the darkened streets, the headlights cutting a narrow path in the dense night. Mark's hands gripped the wheel tightly as the convoy followed closely behind. The sound of gunfire still echoed in his mind, and the tension in the air was thick. The little girl, who had been so quiet for the past several minutes, shifted in her seat. Mark could see her in the rearview mirror, her small hands gripping the seatbelt. He could feel her fear, but he didn't know how to comfort her anymore. He'd promised her safety, and so far, he had kept that promise. But there was still so much left to do. The cartel wasn't giving up, and Mark knew that they would keep coming, no matter how many times they managed to escape. The only way out was to keep moving forward. "Keep the pace," Mark said into the radio, his voice steady. His team responded, their voices calm but with an underlying urgency. They were all in this together, and Mark could feel the unity among them. But as they continued down the narrow roads, Mark's mind was racing. The road ahead was unknown. Every turn could bring more danger, more obstacles. He needed to make sure they didn't get trapped again. "We need to find a new place to lay low," Mark muttered to himself, glancing at the side roads as they passed. There was no telling where the cartel had set up their next trap. As the convoy passed a small bend in the road, Mark's instincts flared. He saw a flash of movement up ahead, just outside the reach of the headlights. He slammed on the brakes. "Stop!" Mark yelled into the radio. The convoy skidded to a halt, the tires screeching as they came to a stop just short of the curve. Mark's heart raced as he scanned the road ahead. A black SUV was parked at the edge of the woods, its headlights off. The doors were open, and there were shadows moving around it. They had walked straight into another trap. Mark's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just an ambush. This was planned. He had to think fast. "They know we're here," Mark said, his voice low and steady. "Prepare for contact." He grabbed his weapon, his fingers brushing the cold metal, and checked the chamber. The sound of footsteps growing louder made his blood run cold. "Mark, what do we do?" Tom's voice crackled through the radio. Mark glanced at his team. They were all ready, their weapons drawn and their expressions tense. The little girl in the passenger seat was trembling now, her fear palpable. Mark looked at her in the rearview mirror. "Stay low and stay quiet," he said softly. He wasn't sure if she understood, but he had to focus. They couldn't afford to be distracted. The shadows ahead were closing in. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as the sound of the approaching footsteps grew louder. He knew they couldn't outrun this. Not now. He had to protect his team, the woman, and the little girl, no matter the cost. The first shot rang out from the trees, the sharp crack of gunfire cutting through the night. Mark dropped to the ground behind the truck, his team following suit. They returned fire immediately, the sound of bullets flying overhead as the firefight erupted in full force. The little girl screamed from the truck, and Mark's stomach twisted. He couldn't afford to focus on that now. He had to stay in control. His team was keeping the cartel at bay, but the attackers were well positioned, and Mark knew they needed to move fast. "We can't stay here," Mark said. "Push forward." He signaled to his team, and they began to advance toward the trees, using the trucks for cover. The cartel members in the woods were well hidden, but Mark had the advantage. He knew the terrain, and he knew how to move under pressure. He kept low, his weapon aimed at the shadows ahead. He could hear the crackling of branches as the cartel moved, trying to flank them. Mark fired, taking down one of the attackers who was moving to the left. The rest of his team fired in unison, their shots hitting their marks. But the cartel was relentless. They kept coming. Mark moved forward, taking careful steps as he approached a thick patch of trees. His eyes scanned the area, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. He couldn't let his guard down. "Mark, we need a way out." Tom's voice came over the radio, desperation in his tone. Mark knew he was right. The cartel wasn't going to stop until they had what they wanted. "Head to the high ground," Mark said, his mind racing. "There's a ridge up ahead. We'll use it for cover." His team moved quickly, taking advantage of the break in the fire. Mark watched the little girl in the truck one last time, making sure she was still safe. She was huddled low, her wide eyes staring at him, a mixture of fear and trust. He couldn't let her down. They reached the ridge just as another wave of cartel members charged toward them. Mark's team opened fire again, this time with more precision, keeping the attackers at bay. They were almost there. The ridge offered them the perfect vantage point, and Mark knew that if they could just hold their ground, they could escape. But as the cartel continued to advance, Mark's thoughts shifted to the future. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They had survived this battle, but the cartel was still out there, and they were coming for them. Mark gritted his teeth, his fingers tightening on his weapon. He had made a promise, and he wasn't about to let them break it. The ridge was their last line of defense. Mark's team had spread out, positioning themselves behind boulders and tree trunks, their guns steady and their eyes locked on the moving shadows below. The cartel had regrouped, and now they were charging, relentless and desperate. Mark's pulse raced as the distant sound of gunfire echoed from below, but he knew they couldn't stop now. He took a deep breath, his eyes flicking to the little girl in the truck one more time. She was huddled down low, trying to make herself as small as possible. Mark's heart ached for her. She had seen too much for someone her age. It was the kind of fear no child should ever experience. But Mark was determined to get her through this. He couldn't let the cartel win. The first wave of attackers broke through the tree line, charging up the ridge. Mark didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon, his fingers steady on the trigger, and fired. The shot hit its target, and one of the attackers dropped to the ground. His team returned fire in unison, but the cartel didn't back down. They were just as relentless as Mark's team. Mark could see the desperation in their eyes. They wanted this. They wanted the woman. They wanted the girl, and they would stop at nothing to get them. Mark's thoughts were sharp as he surveyed the battlefield. The sound of gunfire was constant, a roaring reminder that they were in the middle of a battle they couldn't afford to lose. The night sky above seemed to press down on them, heavy with the threat of the next move. Mark's grip tightened on his weapon. Every shot, every movement counted. His team had made it this far, but they couldn't hold this position forever. Push them back, Mark shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. His team shifted into position, their shots precise as they kept the cartel at bay. Mark's eyes scanned the trees below, looking for any sign of movement. The sound of running feet echoed up the ridge. Another wave was coming. The cartel was going all in. Mark's mind raced, but his body moved on instinct. He fired again, hitting one of the attackers who was trying to flank them. The man dropped, but more kept coming. The fight wasn't over. Mark could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The little girl, the woman, his team, they were all counting on him. He couldn't afford to let them down. The battle raged on, but Mark's resolve never wavered. He kept firing, pushing forward, making sure his team had cover, and keeping the cartel from getting any closer. The little girl's terrified face flashed in his mind. She was depending on him. He couldn't lose her now. As the minutes stretched on, the tide began to turn. The cartel, realizing they weren't going to win this fight, started to retreat. Mark saw it in their movements, hesitant, frantic. They were falling back, but it wasn't over yet. Mark's team stayed on high alert, their weapons ready, as the cartel began to pull back. Mark's heart was pounding in his chest as he watched them retreat into the trees. "We're not out of the woods yet," Mark muttered to himself. He couldn't relax. Not until they were safely out of the area. He motioned for his team to advance. Slowly, cautiously, they began to move down the ridge, keeping their eyes on the surrounding trees. Mark's grip on his weapon remained firm. The sound of the retreating cartel was now faint, but Mark wasn't about to be caught off guard. As they reached the base of the ridge, Mark gave the signal to stop. They were close now, but not close enough to let their guard down. He turned to his team, his eyes scanning their faces. "Stay sharp," he said, his voice low but commanding. "We get to the trucks, and we move fast. No one gets left behind." They nodded in unison. Mark glanced over at the truck, the little girl still inside, huddled low. The convoy was ready to move, but Mark had one more task to complete. He turned to the woman, who had been unconscious for most of the fight. She had woken up during the firefight, but Mark knew she wasn't fully recovered. She was pale, weak, but alive. That was what mattered. Mark gave her a quick nod, then turned to his team. "Let's go," he said. They quickly made their way to the trucks, staying low and covering each other. Mark's eyes were constantly scanning the area, but the cartel didn't appear to be following them anymore. They had made it out of the worst of it. As the trucks started to move, Mark let out a slow breath. They were on the road again, heading for the next safe house. The convoy moved in tight formation, the headlights cutting through the dark night. Mark glanced over at the little girl once again. She was still terrified, but now, there was something different in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. She was holding on to the promise Mark had made, the promise to get her to safety. They weren't safe yet, but they were going to make it. Mark's grip on the wheel tightened as they sped into the night. They had survived the cartel's ambush. They had made it this far. And Mark knew that no matter what came next, he would keep fighting, keep protecting, until they were truly safe. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in hours, Mark allowed himself a breath of relief. They had won this battle, and they would win the next one too. Get ready for an action-packed journey with this intense tale of bravery, survival, and the relentless fight against evil. In this gripping chapter of Hell Angel's stories, a group of brave bikers must fight to protect a young girl and her mother from the ruthless cartel who will stop at nothing to get what they want. As tensions rise and the battle escalates, the bikers must face obstacles and confront their worst fears. The action builds as the story unfolds, with heart-pounding moments that keep you on the edge of your seat. This Hell Angel Stories reveals the lengths these warriors will go to in order to protect those who need it most. With each twist and turn, the stakes grow higher, and the fight for survival becomes even more intense. Join the bikers as they face danger head-on, using all their skills and strength to stand against the cartel. With the odds stacked against them, the bikers' resilience and teamwork are put to the ultimate test. If you're a fan of thrilling, high-stakes Hell Angel stories, you won't want to miss this epic tale of survival, loyalty, and courage. As the bikers race against time to save the innocent, the fight for justice becomes even more personal, and the line between good and evil blurs. Don't miss this thrilling ride. Buckle up for a wild adventure in Hell Angel's stories that you won't soon forget.